Nui ki te hui hui nei. Yeah, actually, it was one of those interesting, planes, trains and automobiles moments. Being a greenie, I'm living in Cambridge at the moment, so I biked to the station in Cambridge. I then caught the train to London. I then had to switch at King's Cross onto the Paddington Express, not realising that the Paddington Express actually took an hour and a half, being a local train. And as I was on the train, it's great, on the train in London, it tells you, to make sure you check which terminal you're going to and exactly which stations there are coverage, in between the different stops. And so as I did that, I read the instructions that I was supposed to check in 3 hours earlier. And of course, I'm still on the train at an hour and a half before the flight closes. And all I can say is I had a phenomenal flight on Air New Zealand, and they were amazing. And it was interesting, as I was actually sitting in the lounge in LA at some ungodly hour this morning, and I put my presentation together, and I realised why we were only allowed one idea, because when I got here, it was 15 minutes long. And so I decided just to focus on one issue. And what it really is around what I call agency, which is the ability or the capacity to act in the world. Now, for those of you who saw me speak at the 10th anniversary of the Ice House, I quoted Kung Fu Panda. And so this is my little reference back to you. And for those of you who've seen Kung Fu Panda, the overall theme of Kung Fu Panda is be the best you can be. And I want to pick that up because often we talk about children in New Zealand as the future. And I think it's really important we don't talk about children as the future, they're the now. They're as much now as you and I are now. And I loved, if Fatty's still here, I have a son his age, isn't that phenomenal? And I loved hearing him talk about that. And I thought, for me, our customers, we've just hit 250,000 users. Our customers are all under 13, and they're very much the now. I want to pick up on something that Murray said, and sorry this is a bit blurry, it's out of a Treasury report, but more importantly, more importantly than GDP to me is the relationship between GDP and GNI. And who am I to argue with someone from the government who's got these figures at their fingertips? But where that brown line, and what that actually is our spending power in the world. And I think that's actually far more important than our GDP. And what it is that relationship between exports and our GDP that Murray talked about is graphed on that line. And that brown line basically shows how prosperous are we. And it starts in the 1970s where we were up there matching Denmark. And you can see that over time our spending power has dropped massively. And Australia's, the good news is theirs has dropped as well, but nowhere near as badly as ours. And the countries up the top are the countries like Norway. And I want us to pick up on some of these themes, but I think it's very important that we understand that over a 30-40 year period, New Zealand has gone from being a relatively wealthy country to actually a relatively poor country. And that's when we relate it in the world. Now, the good news is we're about the second happiest country in the world, so we're incredibly happy about how little money we have. And we've become very resilient. And I want to talk about this because when we think about our children, I've had 4 offices closed this year with earthquakes, right? And we've got to a point where we have to become very resilient as New Zealanders, and we have to be able to start businesses on almost nothing. But actually, it's not a good long-term survival strategy. I want to talk a little bit about international educational outcomes, because Ray asked to sort of put our hands up about whether or not we were clever. And this is a 2006 OECD report, and you'll see there we were 4th. In the PISA ratings, which is the countries that subscribe there, we were 4th in the world for numeracy and literacy. The 2009 figures, we came in at 7th. We have never been out of the top 10. And I think it's a really important thing for us to remember. And the other one in here is that last year in the OECD ratings on digital literacy, we came 2nd. Considering that we barely have broadband, I think that's phenomenal, right? So I think we should think about these things. And what's really interesting to me is, I don't know if you can see the US on there. The US isn't on there. The US has never been in the top 10. And I think it's quite important. So last year I mentioned we came 7th in 2009. The US came 17th. And I really want us to hold that thought, because I think there's been a perception, particularly in the whole debate around national standards, that somehow we're not good at this stuff. And yet we lead the world in the production of literacy education for teachers. And I think that's one of those things that most New Zealanders don't know. The big thing that is a problem is we lead the world in the gap between the best and the worst schools. We have the highest, the biggest, widest gap between basically, we have really brainy white girls who do really well, and that's no surprise. I was at a New Zealand Businesswomen's Network dinner in London a couple of weeks ago, and 80% of us had gone to all-girls schools. And what really disturbed me was that half of those women went to Otago Girls High School. I know, they're all doing incredibly well in London. But this is what we should be fixing. We don't actually need to fix national standards in New Zealand. We need to fix education for Pacifica and Māori in New Zealand. And if we did that, we would move this gap markedly and move ourselves to the top 3 or 4. What we're doing instead is we're going to copy the US, and let's see if we can get ourselves down to 17 like them. Okay? The last thing I just want to point out is, Einstein said, I have no special talents, I'm just passionately curious. And last year I got taken to Singapore, and I was asked by the Minister of Education, we don't get it. The Finns, they don't start school till they're 9, they play in the woods a lot. At 13, they nail us on every international test score. Why is that? And I looked at him and I said, because they play in the woods.
Part of it is
Thank you.
because they have